an attempt to read Sebald's Rings of Saturn in a Deleuzean way. My encounter with Deleuze was actually sort of a sidestep from my thesis. I'm working with irony within the romantic tradition, irony metafiction. And Sebald came up as a sort of postmodernist writing in a romantic tradition. And Deleuze came from somewhere else. So what I will present here now is sort of a work in progress, an attempt to look at Sebald again in a Deleuzean way. And I look at this novel as a movement and process, and I will try to show how it's in itself, from sort of meta position, can be viewed as a sort of becoming animal, or maybe more precisely in this case a becoming silkworm. This also means a discussion of how the novel, this Rings of Saturn, creates identity. So Sebald, well known for most of you, I guess, expatriate German writer who lived and worked as a scholar of German literature here in Manchester and then at the University of East Anglia, up until his untimely death in a car accident in 2001. He's well known to most of us today. His books Vertigo, The Emigrants, The Rings of Saturn and Austerlitz, published in the 1990s and in 2001, has ever since given him a growing reputation as one of the most unique contemporary writers. His half-documentary, half-fictitious writing is often described as colored by the Holocaust and the World War II, and also by his experience of exile. Alienation, loss, and mourning are recurrent terms when people discuss Sebald's prose, and this maybe doesn't sound very Deleuzean, mourning and loss being related with lack and restraint. But there are Deleuzean readings of Sebald. Claudia Albers, for instance, has named the rhizome as Sebald's master trope, and John Sulkowski has discussed the writer as nomad in relation to Sebald. And one must also remember that this exile position that Sebald wrote in made his text free from belonging to any major literary tradition. And many critics have pointed out that Sebald has created an entirely new literary genre with his historical fictional prose, intermingled as it is with disparate pictures that comments the surrounding text in different ways. So turning to this novel, I've been trying to find the movement, the process in this novel that can be related to how the narrator's I and identity is being produced. This novel or travel book, or perhaps memorial publication, is constructed around a lonely wanderer's pilgrimage along the English East Coast. The seaside landscape is strikingly deserted. It consists of long empty beaches, closed-down hotels, sleepy holiday resorts with high unemployment numbers and a few dilapidated manor houses. And what is described as an environment without any ongoing human life or passionate now to take part in. The narrator instead is repetitively drawn into different memories or detailed descriptions of different historical events that he reads about or hears of. We receive comments and information about such disparate things as the extermination of herring in the Baltic Sea, the English bombing of German cities during World War II, ethnic genocide at the Balkans, the devastating effects of colonialism in Congo, the Opium War in 19th century China, and so on. And also the lives of authors such as Algernon Swinburne, Edward Fitzgerald, Joseph Conrad, Chateaubriand, all of them in different ways isolated or trapped in their memories. So we have here sort of a collection of essays, very fragmented, and these many different historical essays all describe some sort of devastation or loss. It creates, of course, a fragmented encyclopedic impression colored by mournful memories. But bit by bit it becomes apparent that what is taking place here is that the narrator's I is being produced through all these historical events. It's a process of constructing identity through points of connections with the other. And J.J. Long has said that Sebald enters the consciousness of the other to construct a sense of narrative and biographical continuity. And if we look at this identity production as a process and as a movement, we soon notice a recurring pattern, a repeated movement in Sebald's pilgrimage through this fragmented historical inferno. Each and every one of the 10 chapters begins at this deserted contemporary English East Coast. The stillness feels almost like a vacuum, and soon the narrator is swept away into some historical memories. He's drawn into and follows attentively a life or a development that every time heads towards some form of painful disaster, death, or extinction. And from this annihilation, there's no new turn, reaction, or movement. The sequence is just followed to its end. And when the next chapter begins, we're just back at the English East Coast without further comment, and then the same movement or pattern is repeated again and again for every new chapter. So turning to Deleuze, we know that repetition expresses the power language to disrupted identity and coherence. And repetition, Deleuze says, presupposes difference, and the only thing that is ever repeated is difference, the eternal return of difference. And this is where we can begin to see how Sebald's narrative not just produces identity through historical memories, but at the same time unfolds the illusion of a coherent subject. So the singularity of repetition does not, according to Deleuze, lose itself to indetermination, but contains the ability to capture the potentials of a life before organization. So what we find in Sebald's repeated memories is some sort of dialectic tension revolving around the construction and deconstruction of identity. This dialectic tension implies a circular movement, implicit also in the title, The Rings of Saturn, and this same circular movement relates also to another of Sebald's books, Vertigo. And vertigo is, by the way, sometimes called memory liberated. It is a state of existence where the normal logic of language and perception is eliminated. And in the Rings of Saturn, this state of dizzy existence, this circular movement, this tension between construct and destruct, or reterritorialization and deterritorialization, is indirectly commented by Sebald. He illustrates this recurring movement by a walk through a labyrinth. And I will quote here. This is the narrator's eye. He has lost himself into a garden labyrinth, and this is what he recalls. In the end, I was overcome by a feeling of panic. The low-leaden sky, the sickly violet hue of the heath clouding the eye, the silence which rushed in the ears like the sound of the sea in a shell, the flies buzzing about me, all this became oppressive and unnerving. I cannot say how long I walked about in that state of mind, or how I found a way out. But months after this experience, which I still cannot explain, I was there once more in a dream, walking the endlessly winding paths again and again, and I could not find my way out of the maze, which I was convinced had been created solely for me. Dead tired and ready to lie down anywhere, I gained a raised area, and when I looked down from this vantage point, I saw the labyrinth, the light sandy ground, the sharply delineated contours of hedges, a pattern which I knew in my dream with absolute certainty represented a cross-section of my brain. So how does then this labyrinthic movement problematize the notion of the human subject, and how is it linked to this deterritorializing counter process of becoming animal? Well, one can say that Sebald loses himself in a referential labyrinth, deferring the moment of self-recognition. And Foucault has commented in a completely different context that this is a book called The Death and the Labyrinth, The World of Raymond Roussel. But I will quote here because it says something about the labyrinthic movement and this process. The labyrinth is linked to the metamorphosis, but it leads to the Minotaur. The Minotaur, by its very being, opens a second labyrinth, and the winding of corridors is repeated, unless it is perhaps the same one. And this mixed being refers to the inextricable geometry which leads to him. The labyrinth is at the same time the truth and the nature of the Minotaur, that which encloses him externally and explains him from within. The labyrinth, while hiding, reveals. So in this revelation or unraveling lies a power to transform, or we can say a metamorphosis. But at the same time, the quote pinpoints some sort of intensification here, I think. Sebald's narrator is caught in a sort of pincer movement. The labyrinth or the rings of Saturn becomes a circuit of intensities to race around. And following Deleuze and Guattari, this oscillating movement of immobile intensity is linked to the becoming animal. The animals are caught in alternative, either beaten down, caught in an impasse, re-territorialized, or open up for multiplication, giving way to molecular multiplicities, deterritorialization. And this oscillating movement is repeated again and again throughout the rings of Saturn, and the conflict revolves around, on the one hand, the impossibility of escaping the ruthless destructiveness of human history, and on the other hand, the occurrences of animalistic lines of escape. And there are scholars who have observed the recurring presence of bugs in Sebald's novel. The narrator states initially that he feels like Kafka's Gregor Samsa, the bug. And later, when he spots a water beetle at a friend's house, he is deeply moved, and he clearly identifies with the silkworms being described in the silk industry, in the ruthless commercial interest in the silk industry. And Bianca Thiessen, she has argued that the bug and its association with metamorphosis shows how transformation is central for Sebald. She states that the bug's metamorphosis in the Rings of Saturn has to do with identity and destruction. And discussing Sebald's metamorphosis, she concludes, the writer's eye is but a tissue of citations from other texts, or, as Roland Barthes specifies in Est Set, from lost codes. And solving the code would reconstitute a lost identity. However, identity is but a complex web of citations for Sebald. And I agree with Thiessen that identity is absolutely nothing more than a web of citations for Sebald. However, with Deleuze and Guattari, I think we can stretch it a bit further. According to them, metamorphosis occurs when things are no longer anything but intensities, overrun by deteriorized sound. And I quote here from the Kafka book, the metamorphosis is a sort of conjunction of two deterritorializations, that which the human imposes on the animal by forcing it to flee or to serve the human, but also that which the animal proposes to the human by indicating ways out or means of escape. So the animal essence, I understand, is the way out, the line of escape. And everything in the animal is metamorphosis, and the becoming animal constitutes a single process, a unique method that replaces subjectivity. And we have several becoming animal processes in this book. There is one sequence I will mention here. It is from a passage when the narrator walks around in the abandoned defense area of awkwardness. Decay, extinction, and emptiness. No human words, nowhere. Just the humming of radio masts. And I read, It was as if I were passing through an undiscovered country, and I still remember that I felt at the same time both utterly liberated and deeply despondent. So we have the tension here already, liberation and feeling despondent, and this polarization then becomes more stressed. I had not a single thought in my head. With each step that I took, the emptiness within and the emptiness without grew even greater, and the silence more profound. Perhaps that was why I was frightened almost to death when a hare that had been hiding in the tufts of grass by the wayside started up right at my feet and shot off down the rough track before darting sideways, this way then that, into the field. It must have been covering there as I approached, heart pounding as it waited until it was almost too late to get away with its life. In that very fraction of a second, when its paralyzed state turned into panic and flight, its fear cut right through me. So now we see the narrator and the hare, they are sort of merging here. And I still see what occurred in that one tremulous instant with undiminished clarity. I see the edge of the grey tarmac and every individual blade of grass. And now we have sort of the narrative perspective now is more or less from the hare's perspective. And I see the hare leaping out of its hiding place with its ears laid back and a curiously human expression on its face that was rigid with terror and strangely divided, and in its eyes turning to look back as it fled and almost popping out of its head with fright, I see myself become one with it. So here we have this sort of what I would read it as a different way of understanding subjectivity. It's not the narrator, I, the subject, and the hare, the object. This is a relation here, and you can't really switch the hare from the narrator. But this hare is just one instance of the deterritorializing animal movement in the text. And my reading then from a meta perspective is that the central animal in this text is the silkworm, and the Latin name for the silkworm is Saturnidae or Saturnia pavonia. So this Saturnic silkworm creates its own cocoon from thin threads coming out of its mouth, and it produces then rings of Saturn, an entire labyrinthic web. And a silkworm that escapes the cruel silk industry undergo a metamorphosis in its cocoon. It sheds its skin and turns into a moth and flies away for good. But whether this particular Saturnic silkworm does escape industrial killing or not, Sebald doesn't say. He just spins the last thread to its end, the final chapter having the same repeated movement as all the preceding chapters or threads. And when it ends abrupt. There's nothing more. The writer's eye has finally come undone, became imperceptible, perhaps. The subject is somehow unfolded, and all there is left is the cocoon, these fragmented threads, these labyrinthic rings of Saturn, maybe just a piece of silk or of textile, but at the same time also an aesthetic piece of text, which for Deleuze would count as alive, and with the indefinite notion always implying the constant possibility of change and things being otherwise. Thank you.